Hey friends, welcome to my Protection Warrior guide for Season 1 of The War Within, patch 11.0. In this guide, we're going to be talking about everything that you need to know as a Protection Warrior to get you to the levels that you want to play at. We're going to talk about the core mechanics of the class, the rotation and priority, your different cooldowns, the talents both on the class tree and the spec tree, as well as both hero talents. And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end of the video talking about your gearing priority and your stats and the tier set that's coming in Season 1 of The War Within. Thank you for taking the time to tune in. Let's dive right in. The Protection Warrior is a shield tank wearing plate armor and relying on block for most of its passive mitigation. The result of the gameplay, if you execute things correctly, is very smooth damage intake and very low overall damage intake. Warriors are able to block every melee attack that comes in and every ranged physical attack that comes in as well. So if you have like an archer mob or a gun wielding mob, rifleman, that's the word, you'll be able to block all of their attacks with your base toolkit and your baseline talent build, resulting in mitigating a lot of the damage that can really be dangerous to other tanks. The main weaknesses that Prot suffers from would be sustained incoming magical damage. You do have really good tools to deal with bursts of magic damage, but if you have sustained magic damage over minutes in a fight, that can be a weakness for Protection Warrior, as well as bleeds, because even though bleeds are physical damage, you cannot block those dot ticks. So those are two of the weaknesses that Prot has, but I think the toolkit really allows warriors to shine in The War Within, and we'll be talking about those as we get into the cooldowns and class abilities later. The core mechanic for Protection Warriors and the resource that all warriors use is rage. The way that you're going to distinguish yourself as a Protection Warrior is in finding the balance between spending your rage on offense versus spending it on defense. You generate rage as protection from a combination of using rage generating abilities and also from taking damage. So if you're in a high incoming damage situation, you're going to have more rage to spend, which is good because that means you can use more rage on your defenses if you need to. The primary buttons that you have in your arsenal to generate rage are Shield Slam and Thunderclap. Shield Slam generates a lot of rage, Thunderclap a little bit, but they both have a relatively short cooldown. Additionally, through the talent tree, you can get bursts of rage when you use Demoralizing Shout, when you use Champion Spear, and when you use Shield Charge, as well as Ravager. Each of these cooldowns allow you to generate large chunks of rage at a time, which can help you to fuel your defenses and really shine in areas where you have a big pull coming in or just a lot of overall incoming damage. As far as the rotation for Protection Warrior goes, you're going to hit Shield Slam on cooldown. This is your highest priority in the rotation. You want to hit Thunderclap on cooldown as well. If they're both available, prioritize Shield Slam over Thunderclap. You also want to keep Shield Block up with 100% uptime, which we are able to accomplish via some talents. And then you're going to balance spending the rest of your rage between Revenge for damage and threat, and Ignore Pain for defense and tankiness. The core rotation doesn't sound that complicated, but finding that balance between spending rage on Revenge to increase your damage output versus spending it on Ignore Pain, which is off the global cooldown, to decrease your damage taken and really build up your defenses, is where there's a lot of depth and complexity to the gameplay. In addition to these core abilities, Protection Warrior has a lot of cooldown abilities that we will spend some time talking about now. First, let's talk about the offensive cooldowns. Avatar is one of the coolest offensive cooldowns that any tank has available. It's on a 1.5 minute cooldown, but this is reduced dramatically by spending rage through the anger management talent. You will end up having very high uptime on this over the course of a dungeon. Avatar simply increases your damage dealt. It also increases your size and turns you kind of gray and like stone looking. It also removes roots and snares on use. So you get this big 20% damage buff. You free yourself of roots and snares. You can pair this up with Demoralizing Shout, which is more of a defensive cooldown, but through talents it can also become a very strong offensive cooldown as well, and it usually syncs up pretty neatly with Avatar, so you want to be using those two together a lot of the time. You don't really want to hold one for the other because you end up reducing the cooldown of both of these through your normal gameplay, so you just want to send them both on cooldown, but they usually do end up syncing up, at least for every other Demo Shout every time the Avatar is up. In addition to this, we're going to be running Ravager in almost every talent build that we have. Ravager has a 1.5 minute cooldown and generates a strong amount of rage while it is active and spinning. It's also a very good threat generation tool, so you'll usually want to use this at the beginning of a pull to help generate threat on everything and get some rage going to fuel your defenses and offensive capabilities if you need to as well. Lastly, on the offensive side of the cooldowns, you will either be taking Champion's Spear or Thunderous Roar from the capstone area of the warrior talent tree, and you just want to send these basically on cooldown. If you're running Mountain Thane, you will usually be running Champion's Spear, which has a 1.5 minute cooldown and gives you increased crit damage while also generating some rage. You will end up usually syncing this up with Avatar and Demo Shout. Just they end up kind of naturally aligning with the cooldowns. I wouldn't recommend holding Champion Spear for too long if both of the other abilities are on cooldown, but if you need to hold it for 5 seconds or so to sync it up, that can definitely be worth doing. If you're running Colossus, you will often be picking Thunderous Roar instead of Champion Spear, and you do want to intentionally sync up Thunderous Roar with your Demolish Damage Burst window and Avatar and Demoralizing Shout to get really massive bursts of damage. In addition to these cooldowns, it is worth noting that Warrior brings a raid buff with Battle Shout, which increases the attack power of all party and raid members by 5%. You want to make sure that you're using this and keeping this buff active. You want to make sure that you're using it before you pull anything. And then if anyone dies during the encounter, once they get battle rezzed, if they're an attack power user, so if they're a melee DPS or hunter, make sure that you hit this again so that they keep that buff up. Next, let's talk about defensive cooldowns. And this is where Warrior really shines and stands out among the other tanks. Protection Warrior has a large set of defensive cooldowns with relatively short cooldowns attached to them, meaning that you can use them fairly liberally. And as long as you're not stacking them all together at the exact same time or overlapping them too much, you can usually have them up whenever you need them. The most iconic of these abilities is Shield Wall, which right now in War Within is on a 3.5 minute cooldown. However, this has its cooldown reduced dramatically through several talents that we will talk about later. The result is that you usually have a cooldown on Shield Wall of under 1 minute. So you can send this almost anytime you need that big defensive burst. It reduces your damage taken by 40% for 8 seconds, and this can help you survive huge bursts of damage with relative ease as a Prot warrior. Demoralizing Shout is one of your best defensive abilities. It has a 45-second cooldown, which you can reduce via talents with your Thunderclap, and it reduces damage that you take from enemies that it hits by 30%. It also increases damage you deal to them via other talents by 20%. This is an ability that you will want to send on cooldown, usually pairing it up with Avatar, but you want to use this as your kind of first defensive ability as you're entering a pack. The other major defensive cooldown that Protection Warrior has available is Last Stand, which increases your health by 30% and heals you for that same amount. This is not a temporary health increase, this is an actual heal. So you use Last Stand, you gain 30% health, and then you heal for however much health you gain at the same time. You do not lose that health again when this effect ends in 15 seconds. Last Stand by default is on a 3-minute cooldown. There is a talent that reduces it to 2 minutes that you can take in some situations. Spell Reflection is an incredibly strong defensive and offensive talent. This is on only a 20-second cooldown. It will reflect the first spell cast that lands on you after you activate it. In addition to this, it will reduce the magic damage that you take by 25% for 5 seconds. So you use Spell Reflect, you will reflect one spell, which can result in some encounters in a large portion of your overall damage. In addition to that, even after you reflect that first spell, other spells will deal 25% less damage to you for 5 seconds, and this is only on a 20-second cooldown. You basically have access to Spell Reflection as often as you want it throughout a dungeon. It is a very strong ability that you should make very good use of as a Protection Warrior. In addition to Spell Reflection, you can choose to talent into Spell Block, which is a very strong defensive cooldown for sustained incoming magic damage, which, as we said earlier, is a historic weakness of the class. When you activate Spell Block, you are able to block spells for 30 seconds, which means that you're going to be reducing all of the spell damage that you take by a significant amount. It is on a 1.5 minute cooldown that you cannot reduce, whereas a lot of your other defensive talents, you are able to get some cooldown reduction on them. Spell Block is locked in at 1.5 minutes. But if you use this on cooldown in sustained magic damage situations, you'll have about 33% uptime on it. It's a very strong ability. I would recommend it anytime you know there's going to be incoming magic damage that you want to mitigate. Lastly, on the defensive side of things, we have Shield Charge. This can be more of an offensive cooldown, but I think it's worth mentioning as a defensive cooldown for a couple of reasons. First of all, through talents that we're going to take, using Shield Charge leads to an increase in shield block-up time. Second, it generates a boatload of rage. You will generally want to be sending Shield Charge on cooldown. You can also use this as a mobility cooldown if you need to. It does have a 25-yard range and charges you to the target. it's kind of got its fingers in a lot of different baskets. We can look at this as just a defense cooldown that will increase your shield block up time and give you a lot of rage. You want to make sure that you're not overcapping the rage that you generate with this, but generally you want to still send this on cooldown and it'll make you a little bit tankier and do a lot of damage. Warriors also have access to a self-heal on a medium length cooldown of 25 seconds in Impending Victory. This does cost 10 rage, but it will heal you for 20% of your health. And if you kill an enemy that yields experience or honor, you will reset the cooldown of it and make the next use cost no rage. This is not the most reliable self-heal in the game, but it can be really effectively used in big pulls and Mythic Plus scenarios. Once mobs start dying, you can get some self-healing out of it. This isn't as strong as it used to. It did receive a nerf from 30% of your health to 20% of your health at the in the infamous tank nerfs that came in a little while back. But this is an important ability to note in your toolkit because this is one of the only ways that you have to recover your health effectively as a warrior. In addition to a large set of offensive and defensive cooldowns, warriors also have a lot of utility cooldowns. So let's talk about those. First, as far as mobility goes, I've already mentioned shield charge, which charges you to a target within 25 yards. We also have regular charge, which also charges you to a target within 25 yards and generates 20 rage. You want to use this as in part of your opener in almost every scenario. You can also use this to charge to a caster mob that is sitting out in the distance, use your interrupt, and then charge back to the pack because you have 2 charges of charge. So many charges, so many uses of the word charge here. I apologize for all of the confusion. But you can use this very effectively to move around the battlefield and try to control enemies. In addition to that, you have Heroic Leap, which, depending on your talent selections, has either a 45 or 30 second cooldown. This is a very strong ability that will allow you to leap around the battlefield if you need to. You can also use Heroic Leap to leap up to certain platforms in most scenarios. As long as you can see like the edge of the platform, you can usually leap up to it. Mobility is a strength of Protection Warriors, and these are 2 of the core reasons why that is. As far as other group utility, Warrior has access to 2 stuns through the talent tree, which I would take in almost every scenario. First, we have Stormbolt, which stuns an enemy for 4 seconds and is on a 30-second cooldown. It does a small amount of physical damage as well, but really this is about the stun. We also have access to an AoE stun in Shockwave, which hits all enemies in front of you, and with another talent, if you hit at least 3 enemies, its cooldown is reduced by 15 seconds. So if you only hit 1 or 2 enemies, it's a 40-second cooldown. If you can hit 3 or more, it'll be a 25-second cooldown. Shockwave is a very strong AoE stun, and it does physical damage to everything as well. I would recommend running this anytime you're going to need to stun things. Berserker Rage has made its return to the baseline toolkit of the warrior. We no longer have to talent into this. Once a minute, you can get yourself out of fear, sap, and incapacitated effects and gain immunity to them for 6 seconds. You can pre-pop Berserker Rage so that you don't get hit by a fear, or if you get feared, you can activate it while you are feared and it will bust you out and make you immune to future fears for the next 6 seconds. Intervene is a strong defensive ability that we have that can help us save a member of the party or raid. You basically charge over to that party member and then you intercept all melee and range attacks for 6 seconds while they are within 10 yards of you. You can use this if your fellow tank in a raid is in a really bad spot, or if you see an ad charging in for a healer, you can use this on them. When you're in Mountain Thane, you also grant a medium-sized magical damage shield to your target of Intervene. So this is a really important cooldown to keep in mind. Rallying Cry is Protection Warriors raid CD. This is something that all warriors have. Unfortunately, it's in a very, very weak state right now. It only grants 10% temporary and maximum health to party members and raid members on a 3-minute cooldown. I would really like to see this get buffed back up to 20%. You can use it, it can save people sometimes, but it's probably not going to be the difference between whether people live or die. You have it, make use of it when you need to. The last utility cooldown that I want to mention is Disrupting Shout. This is pretty easy to access on the spec talent tree, and I would actually recommend using this in almost every dungeon that you run. Disrupting Shout gives you an AoE interrupt. It is on a 1.5-minute cooldown. It combines with your AoE taunt so that you taunt and interrupt everything within 14 yards of you. It is a 6-second interrupt, and this can be very, very useful, especially in pugs, because it serves as a backup interrupt if your pummel is already on CD and a dangerous cast is about to go through. You can also use this just to interrupt multiple casters at the same time. I would take this in almost every build for dungeons, and then probably not in any build for raid, because there are very few raid fights where you, as one of the 2 tanks, will need to have access to multiple interrupts. But Disrupting Shout is a very, very strong ability for general purpose dungeoneering. Lastly, before we move on to the talent tree, let's talk about the stances that you have access to as a protection warrior. Stances are kind of a core identity of warrior as a class, and you have 2 of them as protection in the War Within. You have defensive stance and battle stance. You're going to be spending the overwhelming majority of your time in defensive stance. This no longer decreases the damage you deal, and now only decreases the damage you take. It is a little bit nerfed from previous versions of the game. It only reduces damage you take by 16% instead of 20%, but you don't have any offensive damage reduction from this anymore, so the downsides of using defensive stance are gone. Battle stance, really the only benefit that you gain from this is 3% crit. If you want to be min-maxing your DPS output in raid, you can switch to battle stance when you're not actively tanking things, and then swap back to defensive stance once it's your turn to taunt the boss. But generally speaking, I would just spend most of your time in defensive stance. Okay, moving on to talents. I'm going to go over 3 talent builds in this section. One that is Mountain Thane for Mythic Plus, which I think is really the only hero talent spec you should be running Mythic Plus. You can do some fun things with Colossus, but if you're pushing keys where survivability is going to be any sort of an issue, or damage output is going to be any sort of an issue, Mountain Thane really shines strong in Mythic Plus. And then we'll be going over one for each of the hero talent specs for raid, where I think they're a little bit more balanced and you can kind of choose which flavor you want to go for. This is the talent build that I would recommend for Mythic Plus if you are playing Mountain Thane. We're not going to talk about each talent in detail. You can read through them on your own, but we will talk about kind of where you can find flexibility and like where you have some unique utility in this tree. So the first thing within the hero class, within the hero tree here, I think Stormbolts is a little bit of a trap. This does give you 3 targets that get stunned by Stormbolt, but the 2 that you are not targeting, you don't get to pick which targets those are. So if you're pulling a pack of 8 mobs, 2 random guys are going to get stunned for 2 seconds, which is just going to wreck the diminishing returns on stun value if anyone else has an AoE stun that they're trying to use. And it also has the downside of increasing the cooldown of Stormbolt by 10 seconds. This is an opportunity cost that I don't think is really worth it. And on the other hand, Storm Shield gives you some really nice niche defensive value with Intervene, where you can apply a shield to a party member that will be 3 times your armor in magic damage absorb. Right now I have about 120,000 armor in my character at item level 582. This will obviously increase as the season goes on, but that means that like in heroic dungeon level gear, you're able to put a 360,000 magic damage absorb shield on a party member with Intervene. That's really powerful, and it could be the difference between someone dying to a big AoE or just barely being able to survive it. Looking at some of the other talents on the tree, the talents that you can kind of flex around and spend on the class tree would be Second Wind and Bounding Stride, and then maybe Rallying Cry. Rallying Cry is in a really weak spot right now, and I think if there's a situation where you really need to pick something else up for essential group utility, this is a point that can be dropped. The things that I would consider getting in some scenarios might be Intimidating Shout together with Menace. This could be really powerful with one of the seasonal affixes, where a bunch of orbs spawn that you have to crowd control. Between this and Shockwave, you can basically solo it if you need to, roughly half of the time. You can do most of it on your own with Shockwave anyway, so this isn't really necessary, but it can be handy if you're in a group that is a little bit weaker on the AoE CC abilities. The other things that might be worth considering are going into Honed Reflexes so that you can get Wrecking Throw if you're in a fight where there's a lot of absorb shields that enemies put on themselves. Think like the last boss in Necrotic Wake. He regularly puts this huge damage absorb on himself, and you can chunk through a bunch of that using Wrecking Throw, especially if you line this up with Avatar and Booming Voice to get a bigger damage bonus on that. That might be something that's worth considering. The other point that I would consider is Berserker Shout. This will give you an AoE fear removal for your group. Be mindful that the range on this is only 12 yards, so you're going to have a hard time getting your entire party with this ability. But if you are able to clear the fear from a couple of people, especially if you're near your healer when you use it, that can be big value. On the class tree, there are a couple of things that you can change around if you need to. First of all, I want to shout out Disrupting Shout. It sounds really funny to say. I want to shout out Disrupting Shout as a very, very strong utility ability. I know I talked about this in the cooldown section as well, but I just want to mention it again here. If you're in a dungeon, you can get huge value out of having Disrupting Shout. If you're in a pug, having a backup interrupt for something after you've already used Pummel can really be the difference between a wipe or being able to successfully handle a pull. And if you're in an organized group, this can serve as a backup that you can work into your kick rotation, or it can serve as a backup in case something goes wrong. Maybe your rogue is supposed to kick the next ability, but he accidentally dies. You know, it happens. Well, now you can kind of take care of that and cover that gap while your team recovers from those scenarios. I would take Disrupting Shout pretty much all the time in Mythic Plus. If you don't want to take it, if you feel like you don't need it, or you don't like you're trying to min-max and you really don't need that extra security layer, you can spec out of that and go into Show of Force, which will give you more damage on Thunderclap and Revenge. This can be really powerful when combined with all the talents in Mountain Thane, but I would tend to drop that for Disrupting Shout most of the time. Another talent that's worth mentioning is Fight Through the Flames. If you're kind of like barely dying to magic damage, this is something that you could flex out of Best Served Cold and into Fight Through the Flames to get just a little bit more defense against magic damage. That can be really good, but I think I would default to Best Served Cold in most scenarios. And then lastly, Spell Block is a very powerful cooldown, but if you don't need it for whatever reason, let's say you're just not doing content where you're dying to magic damage, or you're doing a dungeon that's mostly physical damage, you could talent into Bolster instead and get reduced cooldown on Last Stand. Other than that, I wouldn't change too much about these trees. You can make your own decisions, but this is what I would recommend as part of my guide. Moving over to a raid build for Mountain Thane, there's a few changes that we're going to make here. We're dropping the points in Shockwave. You're probably not going to need an AoE stun in raid encounters, and if you do, you can just go back into these points. Instead of those 2 points in Shockwave, we're picking up Leeching Strikes, we're picking up 1 point in Overwhelming Rage, and we're picking up 1 point in Cruel Strikes down here. We're also dropping Crackling Thunder because in most single target raid encounters, you're not going to be far enough away from a boss where you're going to need that extra range on Thunderclap, and in raids, the slow on it is usually irrelevant. If you do need that, you can pick it back up. You can just run with the talents. If there's like a raid boss that's kind of a hybrid where there's ads that you need to control, you can just go back to the Mythic Plus build, and that's totally fine. On the class tree, just one change that I would make is talent out of Disrupting Shout and into Sudden Death. Execute hits like a truck for protection, and I think this is pretty big value. A couple of other things to note just on the class tree. We do have a choice node here between Defender's Aegis and Impenetrable Wall. I think Defender's Aegis is kind of bait. You do get 1 additional charge of Shield Wall, but the result of that is not that you have twice as many uses of Shield Wall over the course of an encounter. It's just that you can use it 1 additional time while it's on cooldown. This does give you 60 seconds of cooldown reduction. However, you get minutes of cooldown reduction from Impenetrable Wall. Combining this with Anger Management, Shield Wall does have a 3.5 minute cooldown by default, but between Impenetrable Wall and Anger Management, you can bring that down under a minute most of the time. Bring that down to under 1 minute most of the time. If there's no spell damage that you need to block in the raid encounter, you can obviously swap to Tough as Nails or Bolster, depending on what you want to do. Another difference, if you played a lot of Prot Warrior late in Dragonflight, Into the Fray is kind of our default talent pick here, but because haste levels are so low and the way haste scales multiplicatively instead of additively, I think we should be defaulting to heavy repercussions in pretty much all scenarios. This is going to give you more rage generation, and it's going to cause Shield Slam to increase the duration of your shield block while it's active, and that is really essential to maintaining 100% uptime on shield block, which you always want to do in all scenarios. If you want to play a Colossus build in the raid, things are going to look quite a bit different here, and we'll talk about why as the talents load out here. First of all, you'll notice that we're dropping Champion Spear, and we're moving over to Thunderous Roar. And the reasoning here, Thunderous Roar has been changed so that it only increases your other bleed damage while Thunderous Roar is active. And we can use this with Colossus to kind of like triple down on getting a huge burst damage window. The Capstone talent in the Colossus tree gives you a 20% damage buff, up to a 20% damage buff, for 10 seconds after you use Demolish, which is, of course, the big, powerful, chunky ability that you get with Colossus, and you can pretty reliably line that 20% damage up with the 20% damage from Avatar and the 20% damage from Booming Voice. You put all of those together, and then you hit Thunderous Roar, and you're doing omega chunks of damage after you've already done a ton of damage with Demolish. That can be a really strong way to really burst out single target damage when you need to. This is something that might be a little bit degenerate, but if you really want to kind of double down on doing damage, you can not only talent into Sudden Death, but you can talent into Massacre and then Juggernaut as well. and then you just become an absolute execute machine in this single target raid build. I would not recommend doing that in situations where you might be in danger of dying, probably not in progression, but if you want to parse, or if you just need a little bit of extra damage to beat an enrage timer, that can be a decision that you make to kind of push your team over the edge. And the last thing I want to cover in this guide is gearing. How do you gear your Prot warrior? Obviously, you're going to be wearing plate armor, you're going to be wearing a one-handed weapon and a shield, but what do we try to prioritize in the gearing process? For most of your armor pieces, so anything that has armor and strength as a stat, which would include your shield, and I would also include your weapon in this, even though it doesn't have armor, item level is going to be king. You're going to want to go for the highest item level pieces that you can get your hands on, because armor and strength and stamina together are going to outweigh the differences in value between the secondary stats. Most of the secondary stats are pretty good for Protection Warrior. We'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in a minute, but you want to prioritize getting your primary stat, your stamina, and your armor as high as possible. Those are going to give you the most bang for your buck on gearing out your character. Now, if you have two pieces of the same armor slot at the same item level, or you're thinking about like what rings, what necklace do I want, maybe how do I value different trinkets, that's when the secondary stats can really come into play a little bit more. So let's talk about those. Haste is your best secondary stat by a decent margin. Haste not only increases your attack speed, it reduces your global cooldown, which can lead to more rage generation. It reduces the cooldowns of Shield Slam, Thunderclap, and Shield Block, which can help you achieve 100% uptime on Shield Block a lot more easily. And in addition to this, it increases your attack speed. It's just a really good overall stat. It's going to be your best all-around stat. Your worst stat is going to be Mastery, and we'll talk about a couple of reasons why here. Mastery for Protection Warrior increases your chance to block and increases your chance to critically block. The first problem with Mastery is that the increases your chance to block is a little bit of fake value. In practice, you're going to have 100% uptime on shield block while you are actively tanking things at least, and this gives you 100% block chance. So you can't get any higher than 100% obviously. So right out of the gate, Mastery loses a little bit of value because of that. The crit block is nice, but looking at it, the baseline amount of damage that we already block being like 40% or higher, getting that 40% to 80% damage reduction from melee attacks isn't nearly as valuable as some of the defensive value that the other stats are going to be able to provide point for point. Mastery is not bad, it's just not nearly as good as the other stats. Now, I haven't talked about crit or verse yet, and I would have those roughly equal in the middle, probably closer to value in haste than to mastery. So they're going to be like, you know, if we're looking at it on a spectrum, you've got haste, which is really good, mastery, which is your worst stat, and then probably toward the haste side of the spectrum, verse and crit would be roughly in the same spot as each other. Versatility is just a great stat for every tank. You get a passive damage scaler and you get passive damage reduction scaling. And then crit gives you big damage value. If you're playing Colossus, you do get some extra crit damage, so you may want to value crit a little bit more. It also does give you parry chance, which in Mythic Plus is always really, really nice to have. But at the end of the day, you probably just want to go for item level and then kind of customize your secondary stats with your enchants and with which pieces of jewelry you go for. If you have a chance to decide between like haste and crit or mastery or verse on an armor piece, assuming the item level is the same, or maybe within like 3 item levels, you want to lean toward haste, but that's probably not going to be the difference between you living or dying in most scenarios. Usually if you find yourself dying as a Prot warrior, it's because you've either mismanaged your rage or you are doing content that you are undergeared for, and at that point secondary stats aren't really going to make a difference. Lastly, we're going to talk about the tier set for Prot warriors coming up in Season 1 of the War Within. Now, as a general disclaimer, all of the tier sets this season are on the weak and underwhelming side. Blizzard did this by design because they want the emphasis on player power and choice and customization to be within the hero talents for Season 1. So these set bonuses are not going to seem super impactful. That's okay. Almost no classes have a set bonus that is super impactful, but we'll talk about what they are here. For the 2 set, when we reset the cooldown on a shield slam, you gain a buff that increases your shield slam damage by 5% and reduces all damage you take by 3% for 6 seconds. You know, nothing really to write home about here. You probably won't really notice this in active gameplay. That shield slam damage increase is really only going to apply to your next shield slam, because we're not going to be getting our cooldown on shield slam lower than 6 seconds in Season 1 gear at least. And then the 3% damage taken, like, it's not bad, but it's probably not ever going to be the difference between living or dying as the tank. The 4-set, shield slam critical strikes increase the damage dealt by Thunderclap and Revenge by 10% for 8 seconds. This is a nice damage bonus. Thunderclap, especially for Mountain Thane, is a huge portion of your damage, and Revenge for Colossus is also a huge portion of your damage, but this damage bonus is locked behind shield slam critical striking. Even if you're stacking crit in Season 1, you're not going to get to a value where you have super high uptime on this. So this is just a little bit of extra damage, and there's no defensive value tied to this. So you definitely want to run the 4-set when you have the pieces available, but I don't think it's going to be the difference between living or dying, or clearing content to a meaningful degree in Season 1. As far as crafted items go for Protection Warrior, we're probably going to want to run 2 Dusk Thread Linings. These increase your versatility while you're above 80% health. The embellishments this season are not particularly great, especially compared to what we had in Dragonflight, but this is probably going to be the best bang for your buck. You can put this on any armor piece, including your shield, if you want to craft a shield. That can be a really high value piece to get a high item level crafted piece early in the season, so you may want to do that. I would probably just use your sparks to fill in the gaps in your gearing, especially if you're not a Mythic Raider. These are going to be some of the highest item level pieces that you get for a long time in the season, and you obviously don't want to put them on a tier slot before you have your 4-set, but you could put them on things like your belt or your boots. Shield is a fantastic option in my opinion, unless you get a Mythtrack shield really early from the vault. At the end of the day, which items and which slots you craft in is probably not going to make a huge difference. You're just going to want to fill in based on what drops you get and what you don't. Thank you everyone for watching my guide. If you made it to this point in the video, please consider giving us a like and a subscribe on the YouTube channel. I stream a lot of tanking content, with Protection Warrior being my main class, on Twitch and on YouTube, starting around 9 p.m. Pacific most nights right now. So if you have a chance to check out the stream, please do so. I would love to hang out with you guys and answer any questions that you might have that I'm able to answer. If you have any questions and you can't catch my streams, feel free to put them in the comments down below and I'll respond to them as I'm able to. If there's anything I missed or you think I got anything wrong, please let me know. I love to hear feedback, and I'd like to make sure that we're getting the right information out to the community. If you want to support the stream and you want to support the channel, we do have memberships available. You can choose to do those if you want to. Absolutely not required. I don't paywall anything behind those. Those are just ways that you can support the channel and contribute a little bit if you would like to. Thank you all for watching the video, and until next time, my friends, farewell.